Hi, everyone. I'm Becca. I'm Series Director of Access and Cultural Innovation, and I offered to do an intro for Rochelle today. So just to give you some context, Series has a strategic plan, and it has 4 imperatives. So the first imperative is about doing awesome research. I'm just going to make them really simple. The second imperative is about collaborating, right, across different disciplines. The third one is about workplace culture, and the fourth one's about communication and outreach. So I'm working across those 4 imperatives with some co-chairs and advisory board. And so the second imperative around collaboration, I've been trying to facilitate NOAA researchers doing talks here, and then CU Boulder researchers doing talks in the NOAA building. We've even brought NOAA researchers to the classroom. So I've been working on this, and that's why we had Ellen Considine come and do a talk here. Allison's just been great saying, Becca, do you have ideas of people we can bring? So thanks for being open to bringing in Rochelle today, who's from the Physical Sciences Laboratory over at NOAA. She did start at Series when she was getting her PhD in the ATOC department here, and actually got an OPA, an Outstanding Performance Award for the Scientific Development, Demonstration, and Technology of a 1 to 2 week forecast fire prediction tool, which was a first for NOAA back in 2022. You saw her bio for today, so it talks about her research focusing on reducing risk from wildfires by characterizing the environmental conditions needed to successfully implement prescribed fires, a critical wildfire mitigation tool. So she'll be talking about that. But I love to bring, and she got her BS in meteorology from Florida State and her MS and PhD from here. So she was just over in Seek when she was here, and then joined Series as a research scientist in the summer of 2018, and then transferred over to become a federal employee. But I wanted to share that she enjoys hiking and biking. I met her at the bike rack today, so that's impressive. I'm very cold today, so I'm impressed by that. Scrambling, and she's been working on cooking. So if you're interested in sourdough starter, she's going on that journey now. So she would be interested.
6 years behind the trend.
Yeah, but that's all right. There's no keeping up. It's all off. So please help me welcome Rochelle.
Thank you, Becca and Allison and Casey, for the introduction and for the invitation to come talk today. I'm excited to share this work that we're doing, bringing in environmental data to better understand and ultimately help predict conditions that are conducive for prescribed burning. And I also want to thank our super awesome comms guy at PSL for helping come up with the title, Burn Baby Bird. That was all his idea. And I mentioned my collaborators here listed, and they're all from a wide variety of agencies, which was a really rewarding part of this work, the interdisciplinary part of having meteorologists, fire ecologists involved. So we have folks from the Physical Sciences Lab, Global Systems Lab at NOAA, the Nature Conservancy, U.S. Forest Service, and then, of course, the Cooperative Institute Series and at CSU. So for prescribed burns, we're going to be focusing on, these are intentional burns that are put on the landscape to achieve some sort of objective, and we'll talk a little bit about what some of those are. But first, want to introduce 2 main types of prescribed burns. And these prescribed burnings that I'm going to talk about occur in Northern California, but these also occur across all around the world, that different types of prescribed burns happen. So the 2 main types are pile and broadcast. And pile is much like in the name, and these are some pictures taken more locally of different piled up debris in kind of a limited area that they're piled up of old vegetation and limbs that are kind of thinned and taken down from some of the trees and then put into piles. And then usually there's many of them in one burn project, and then they're ignited either all at once, or they're come back and split up into multiple burn days. And this is also an example here on the top right of at the Lafayette Golf Course, where they were kind of collecting debris within the ditch to help with irrigation along the golf course. And these burn project sizes do vary, but this is from our data that I'll be showing you. And so the median size of the pile burn projects is 7 acres, but can be maximum in our data of 850 acres. Broadcast burns, in contrast, are typically much larger. The burn project size is 20 acres median, and the maximum is 3,000 acres. And these broadcast burns, I like to think of casting a wide net over the landscape. These are mimic more natural wildfires at low intensity. And they are trying to burn a lot of the surface area rather than limited piles. And these are some pictures taken in Northern California from one of our collaborators, Ben Hatchett, who conducts prescribed burns. And you can see these are, they're serious fires still, and there's a lot that goes into them, a lot of strategic planning and organization that needs to come into place many weeks and sometimes years in advance to make these prescribed burns happen. So fire practitioners, and I'll mention that name a bit throughout, these are basically anyone who is igniting prescribed burns. And so there's governmental agencies across the board, federal, state, local, and tribal, private companies, and individual landowners will do these prescribed burns, as well as farmers. And some of the reasons that they do them are cultural, to encourage regrowth and plant production, and also agricultural cleanup after harvest. And then you have all these dead corn stalks. You might do prescribed burns to help clear that out and reintroduce nutrients back into the soil. Controlling invasive species, whether they're insects or noxious weeds. Restoring and maintaining the ecosystem function, because fire is a natural part of the ecosystem, and maintaining or reintroducing the natural return level of fire on the landscape. Oh, thank you. And then also the part that at the Physical Sciences Lab at NOAA that we are most interested in working towards improving is reducing the wildfire severity, because our mission is protection of life and property. So an example is a schematic of how these prescribed burns can be introduced to the landscape and results in reduced wildfire severity in the Western US. There's this really cool graphic by this paper by Davis et al. In 2024. And you can see here on the top left figure, this is a dense forest that a wildfire hasn't occurred here yet, but this is, you can see there's dead trees, there's a lot of vegetation on the ground, and trees are close together. And you can imagine if wildfire comes through, that there's a lot in abundance of fuel that could be burned. The spacing can help promote wildfire growth and spread within the forest, and also there's connections to be able to have the fire move from the ground up into the canopy of the tree. And so in post-wildfire in this scenario, you likely have a lot of tree mortality left at the end, so high wildfire severity. But in contrast, several observational studies found that through thinning, first kind of reducing the fuel load manually, and sometimes putting them in piles or just removing them from the area altogether, combined with prescribed burning. So before any particular wildfire comes, you help reduce the fuel load and the spacing between the trees. And then if a wildfire were to happen in this area, you can see it, the idea is that it would burn a lot less intensely and maintain on the surface floor and not get into the canopy of the trees, and likely would be easier to suppress if that were needed. And a really remarkable example of this is from a prescribed burning project in Oregon. And this was a project where they had done different phases of the prescribed burning. You can see they just did thinning on the bottom, thinning, and they were able to do the prescribed burning in the middle section, and then no treatments were done in this area. And it happened to be that a wildfire came through in 2021, and there were different effects here, where you could see that the thinning and prescribed fire left a pretty healthy looking forest. And the no treatment area was pretty scorched earth left and not many trees. So we know that these can be effective tools for reducing wildfire hazard. And in addition to that, the U.S. Forest Service has put together a 10-year strategic plan to implement more prescribed burning across the Western U.S. And they've currently treated 2 to 3 million acres per year on U.S. Forest Service land, but they were wanting to ramp this up to additional 50 million acres of treatment across the 10 years. So how can we use environmental data and data science to improve prescribed burning operations? Our approach is to first detail characteristics of past burns, understand situations, times of year, places that they're burned in. Learn burn practitioner preferences, not just what's theoretically burnable, but what did they choose to burn under given their constraints and considerations. And we're going to look at that based on burn type, which hasn't been done before yet. And then once we understand their preferences and environmental conditions that they're targeting, we can estimate a realistic number of burn windows of opportunity. And this can ultimately help with improving on a monthly scale, how often should they be able to meet this burn criteria with the hope to reducing wildfire hazard. So our study domain is in Northern California, and this polygon here represents the Northern California Geographic Area Coordination Center, where a lot of wildfire suppression and mitigation resources are managed. And there are also a lot of prescribed fires happen here, so the data set was robust comparative to other areas. And it also has one of the highest number of high-risk fire sheds in this region, and those are just areas that have been deemed aerial sources of high risk to important infrastructure. So our data that we're using, our prescribed fire data, is from the Prescribed Fire Incident Reporting System, or the PFIRS data. And this is based on approved burn permits. So these are, in California, most prescribed fires need to get approval from the local air districts. And once they do, they get a burn permit approved. And this has information about the ignition date, the coordinates, the requesting entity, whether it's a government entity or individual landowner, the area that they're wanting to burn, and the burn type, pile, or broadcast. And this gives us over 15,000 past prescribed burns over 14 years. And then connecting this to the environmental data, we use GridMet and Aerify reanalyses. These are both gridded climate data sets where we can get information about the local conditions on the day and the location of each prescribed burn. So we could get information here about the temperature, moisture, and wind through these variables, and also the fuel moisture within the dead small branches and logs. This is the variables called the dead fuel moisture at 100 hours and 1,000 hours. It's their response, how long it takes for them to respond to their environment and dry out or moisten the fuels. And then we also have a fire difficulty indicator. That's the burning index of how difficult it might be to manage a fire if one were to occur based on the spread and intensity. And also a smoke dispersion and transport indicator called the ventilation index. And then we're also going to look at how these local conditions and these prescribed burn days, what the large scale atmospheric pattern or circulation patterns look like in the middle of the atmosphere. And this is a variable used by forecasters often to understand where broad scale pressure patterns, the troughs and ridges are in the atmosphere. And this is the Z500 or 500 hectopascal pressure. So now I'm going to combine these first two about detailing past characteristics of burns and also identifying some of those preferences of when burn practitioners chose to put fire on the landscape. And we'll start with broadcast burning. So this figure here is has a lot on it, but it's basically a 2D histogram where we have month of year on the bottom and the year increasing on the vertical axis. These different colors represent the number of broadcast burns that happen on any individual day of the year across our region. So about 2.5 on average is what happens on a given burn day, but we can have upwards of 20 different broadcast burns happening across the region at once. And we can see here on the right, this is the annual area treated each year of in our data set. And we can see general increase, especially in these last 3 years when the wildfire implementation plan has been implemented. You can see there's been this push to start doing more prescribed burning. And on the top, this is, we can see the time of year when the most area is burned from broadcast burning. And you can see that this happens, I marked here by the stars, the 2 months with the greatest number of ignitions. So this is happening in the shoulder seasons in June, right after green up and growth of vegetation and before the peak wildfire season happens. And there's very little to no broadcast burnings happening in the peak summer wildfire season. And then they pick up burning again in October. So there's strong seasonality to the broadcast burning in Northern California. And connecting these to the environmental conditions or preferences for burning, we can aggregate all of the past broadcast burns and extract what the weather was at that location and day of the burn, as well as the 7 days leading up to the burn and the 7 days after the burn. So How to read this plot here is that this is the day of ignition and this is the month of year. And on average, we can see these colors represent the average daily standardized anomaly of that particular day. So in this situation here for January, these orange would indicate that the maximum temperature was above normal, above the climatology at leading up to in the week leading up to ignition broadcast burns. So when we extend this to our other variables, we find that the conditions are warmer and drier in the week and in the day, including the broadcast burn ignitions in the cool season. And that's shown by these red rectangles. So the top ones, this is our temperature and burning index show up as statistically significant abnormalities compared to normal. And then the bottom plots, these browns, show our moisture variables that it's typically drier than normal for the time of year. And I'm going to next show you in February an example because that has these streaks of drier and warmer conditions. So I will next connect those local conditions to the large scale weather pattern for the time of year. So broadcast ignitions, on average, we can see on ignition day that they're associated with abnormally high heights in the 500 millibar pressure level. And so we can see that these high heights here, and these are typically associated with sinking motion. So especially on the downstream side of the ridge axis, so this is typically related to converging air and then leading to sinking motion towards the surface. And this leads to warmer conditions and drier conditions, drier relative humidities, and sunnier cloud free. So all of these make the fuels more receptive to drying and warming up and being more receptive to burning. For February, which in this part of the country is typically the wet and cool time of year. And so next we can see how this particular pattern, because this one just shows what the 500 millibar pattern looks like on the day of ignition, but we can take this latitudinal area, average it to flatten it down. And so, for example, all of these stars get averaged together and flattened to produce this one particular area on this Hofmahler diagram. So this diagram is showing us that at this particular longitude, that's the average condition over this latitudinal area. And so we can see that if we then compute this for all of our longitudes across here, we can see our different high and low pressure, our anomalous patterns. And then we can look at how this evolves 7 days before ignition day and then 7 days after. So what's really interesting about this particular pattern, in order to do broadcast burns in February, it appears that the burn practitioners are targeting a pretty persistent high height anomaly just to the west and over the Northern California GAC region, which is indicated by these blue vertical lines. And so this is a really persistent pattern drying out and warming these fuels in preparation for burning a large area. And whenever I was working on this project in parallel, I was talking to some different fire practitioners, and one of the exchanges was really interesting because we found that what we were seeing in the data was aligning with what this fire practitioner had shared. They said in the winter and spring, so like in February, they look for days in the future that are red. And so this is an example of like a map I showed before, but now a forecast that they can get in real time. And they were typically targeting this red high height anomalies in the wintertime. They say in the late spring and fall, they look for blue. And they said they don't really know what they're looking at or why this works, but it works really well and goes further into the future than other forecasts do. And this was really enlightening because it matched kind of what we were seeing in the data, but also gave some sense of the fire practitioners really are targeting these times and they know that these are predictable. And this large scale pattern is more predictable than a lot of the local scale situations in our numerical weather prediction models. So if this is something that they can use and something that they're looking at, some of the future could be working on predicting these large scale patterns that are conducive for prescribed burning. So next I'll move on to POW burning to understand what the preferences are and times of year that pile burning is conducted. First, wanted to note that pile burning is much more numerous. There's 4 times more pile burn projects than broadcast burn projects in our data set. And that there is also strong seasonality, an even wider gap in the summertime for prescribed burning. In most of our prescribed burning, our top 2 ignition months are November and December. And they still continue into the winter and into the late spring, but it's starting to taper off. So, and also, since the implementation of the wildfire strategic plan, there's also been a ramp up of pile burning in Northern California. The environmental preferences were a little less interesting as far as the number of months that showed statistically significant anomalous results compared to broadcast burning. That is in part because these pile burns appear to be happening in a wide range of conditions. So getting a amplified signal of one type of preference that they're looking for didn't show up as much in the pile burning as broadcast burning. But what we did see is that there are cooler and wetter conditions that are preferred preceding pile ignitions, particularly in the early fall. So we can see in October here, this cool streak of cooler than normal temperatures and less high intensity or spread risk of a burning index indicator in that month as well. And the greens indicate that there is more moisture in the atmosphere and as well as in the dead fuel moistures that they would be burning. And this connects really well to our physical understanding of how those anomalous cool and wetter conditions connect to patterns in circulations in the upper atmosphere. And so in contrast with the broadcast burns, in that situation I showed you before that they had high anomalies, we actually have low anomalies over the Eastern Pacific and the Northern California GAC region. And these low anomalies are associated with rising air, and this helps contribute to increased relative humidities and cloud cover, and there's also cooler air associated with these low anomalies and potentially precipitation. So they're really targeting this cooler and wetter conditions in order to do pile burns in October. And again, if we collapse this down in order to look at how these are progressing in the week before and after, we can see that it's a little less persistent, quite a bit less persistent than what we saw in our previous example for broadcast burning. We can see that these low heights, these cooler, wetter conditions are moving in about 4 days before the prescribed burn starts to take place, but then retrogrades and moves out pretty quickly. So this indicates that there's a pretty narrow, short window of time in order to conduct these pile burns in October, given the preferences that they're typically igniting under. So how can we use this information to estimate the number of burn windows of opportunity? So like what I showed before is we can take the environmental conditions on the particular prescribed fire locations and days, and we can create distributions of those different variables. So we can see that our temperature is typically between 32 degrees Fahrenheit and 110 degrees Fahrenheit, for example, for all past burns in a particular area. And that can help us define what's called a burn prescription. And the burn window of opportunity is when our environmental conditions simultaneously meet our burn prescription criteria. And burn prescription criteria are defined for every burn that's conducted. It's just the range, the upper and lower thresholds of what conditions need to be in place in order to conduct that burn. And what we're doing in this data set is a different approach, and where we're using our data to inform what our thresholds should be, rather than imposing a theoretical bound of what's burnable, or using parts of some ranges that are found for in the literature for different parts of the country. So this is going to really give us a more tailored approach of what the burn practitioners typically burn in for the time of year. And we divide these ranges, we define ranges based on 4 different subgroups where we're celebrating lower and upper elevations and also different vegetation types. So we have crop, grass, savanna, shrub, which is in these greens, and then forested areas. So for example, if we aggregate all of our broadcast burns that happen in June and collect all the maximum temperature values at these different subgroups, this is what the box plots, the distributions of those temperatures look like. And so we can play around with different thresholds, but we ended up defining our prescription criteria based on the 5th and 95th percentile thresholds of our distributions. So here, and then we do this for all of our different smoke fire indicator, wind speed, fuel moisture, and temperature variables. And so a burn day is when all of these criteria are met for their particular vegetation and elevation location. So on average, this is for October, and we do this analysis for each month. Based on our burn criteria, I'm sorry, the yellows are pretty faded. Based on our burn criteria, this is the estimated number of burn opportunities that the burn practitioners can expect to get in October. And for broadcast burns here on the left and pile burns on the right. And so average wide across the SCAC region, there are about 13 days that you can expect in October to be able to meet broadcast criteria. And in contrast, there's 3 times fewer pile burn opportunities in October, especially here in the Central Valley. And the most opportunity for broadcast burning in October is along the coastal forests where it's cooler and wetter. So one question that came up when I saw that result is how could there be so few pile? Remember, there were 3 times fewer pile, but so many broadcast opportunities in the same month. And this is where our particular analysis helped highlight this, because if we just used theoretical burnable ranges, you wouldn't see any difference between the broadcast and the pile burns. You would just see that this is a burn day, not that there are other considerations based on the burn type. And so while pile burns are more limited in area and typically less complex to conduct, they burn more intensely because they're just masses of really dry fuel that's been drying out. Sometimes they leave it out there for a year or more to get really dry, and these flame lengths can be really high. So the risk to escaping embers to outside of the project area or up into the trees is higher. But because it's less complex, there's typically not as many people or resources around in case there is an issue with containment. So what we're seeing is that because of the type of fire it is, that they are choosing these wetter and cooler conditions. And so we show that here in our analysis that these are the 8 different variables. And now these plots show the number of days that are that each variable is the reason for not meeting criteria. So we can see here on the top right that we weren't able to meet as much days for pile burning in October because the temperature was too high. The burning index was too high. It's been a long time since the last wetting rain, and the dead fuel moisture often was too low to conduct the burn. And then in contrast, so this is the flip to that, is that there's a lot more pile burn opportunities than broadcast burn opportunities, about twice as many in February. And so the question here is, why are there so many pile burn opportunities in February, but so few broadcast? And this is also related to how these particular burns are conducted. And we can see here for broadcast burns that the maximum temperature is often too cool to conduct the burn. It would be difficult for a fire on the landscape to ignite and carry on its own without a lot of intervention. And the fuel moisture is just, dead fuel moisture is just too high. But pile burns can, because of their size, there can be a lot more human intervention into these burns. So they can put tarps or paper on top of them and helping kind of keep them dry and burn them even when you can see there's snow on the ground. And so this allows the burn practitioners to effectively be able to detach a little bit from the environmental condition and target based on more objective safety for these burns compared to broadcast burns. So essentially what we found is that burn type matters when estimating burn windows and indicating what the prescription criteria could be, because there are considerations about safety and meeting objectives that really matter based on the burn type. So in summary, we talked about prescribed burns being effective at reducing wildfire hazard in the Western US and saw strong seasonality of past burns dependent on the burn type. When we combined our environmental data with burn permit data, we can reveal that burn practitioners have an aggregate preference. We saw streaks of warmer and drier than normal conditions leading to broadcast burning in the winter and the early spring months, and streaks of cooler and wetter than normal conditions for pile burning in the fall. Some of the other months didn't have really a preference, indicating that these times were more open to a wider range of scenarios. We saw these local conditions were related to the large-scale flow pattern and aligned well with our meteorological understanding of that large-scale flow connected to the local scale pattern. And what's exciting about that is that these large-scale patterns are more predictable in our numerical weather prediction models. So this potentially could lead to having more days or even weeks advance notice of an upcoming prescribed burn window. And the number of burn windows heavily depends on the burn type and time of year, seeing 3 times more broadcasts than pile burn opportunities in October and 2 times more pile than broadcast burn opportunities in February. And I know this is an interdisciplinary group, so I just wanted to kind of stoke some potential areas where prescribed burning could use your data in your analysis. So planning and weather forecasting is needed across scales, spatially and temporally for conducting prescribed fires. We need this information right at the location of where the fire is occurring on the day of with observations, but also being able to expand out, identifying areas that need this more than others, given limited resources. So we need data, observations, and simulations, as well as data analysis that can learn more about the weather and the climate that impacts prescribed burning and the need for prescribed burning. Also, information about fuels, particularly the live fuel moisture, is something that I keep hearing from the burn practitioners that it's really hard to estimate, especially the fine fuels like the grasses that respond very quickly to the environment, and getting good estimates of what that is. Air quality is a huge part of prescribed burning. It can, even if everything else is in place, if the air quality is going to cause issues for people with respiratory issues or other vulnerable communities, the prescribed burn won't happen. Also, ecosystem impacts, the positive and negative of doing these. A lot of work is happening in that area, and if that's something that you're able to contribute to as more prescribed burning is happening, I imagine that's needed even more. And then post-mortem case study analysis of successes and undesired outcomes, especially escapes or when infrastructure or people were harmed from prescribed burns. And from a forest ecology and biology perspective, defining what the objectives are and also defining what it means to be successful. Like, did you need a certain number of trees or a certain reduction in the number of invasive species to be achieved, and like what temperatures do they need to burn at to achieve that objective? And then finally, community engagement via social scientists. Prescribed burning is sort of a touchy subject for a lot of people. Imagine a prescribed burn happening near your home or in your community, your favorite forest. This brings up a lot of concern because there is some risk involved. So in engaging with the community, understanding their perception, building trust, and helping them prepare during times of prescribed burn to see smoke on the landscape and not be so concerned about it when it is in a controlled environment is something that is needed. So I put the references here, and I also wanted to note that all of this work here, as well as more details of the analysis, including all the months, are available or hopefully going to be available soon because this work is currently in review at Fire Ecology. And that's all I had to share. And if there was time for questions, happy to answer those.
If I'm understanding correctly, these two flavors of fire are at the extreme. Like the pile fire is trying to get the least amount of fire for the fuel, and the other one is trying to get the most fire for the fuel. Like the cold burn, they have like a lot of fuel and they're trying to get the least amount of fire possible that still burns that. And so that's why they're using coal.
Well, so I think there's a lot of different objectives that people are trying to achieve with this, but I think and that broadcast burn is a little bit tricky because they're trying to either get a certain amount of heat and intensity when they're fired to achieve a certain objective, ecological objective. But with pile burns, I do believe that most of the reason for pile burning is just to reduce the fuel. They want to get it, burn it down, the fuel pile load. So with that one, I think they really do want intense fire, because especially if there's moisture in any of those really large logs, it will take a long time to burn or might smolder and stick around for a while. So I imagine that they are trying to, yeah, get intense burns there, but doing it in the cooler, wetter conditions to mitigate risk of it embers and growth exceeding outside of the fire project.
Generally, also those pile burns are to clear out stuff that was mechanically thinned somewhere. They can take that anywhere they want and burn it in little piles, just to get rid of what they took out.
But it's way more controlled.
It's way more controlled because they do it little. They might do thinning in the summer and keep it until they can do a pile later on some land that they can handle. It's not really an ecological thing so much because you could burn that pile anywhere you can make the fire happen.
Yeah, it is helpful to do pile burns in steep terrain because it's harder to get in there and do like a more controlled broadcast burn, which they do, but if you can kind of condense things to a certain area and you can have your resources, your people around these areas, it makes it a little easier to manage.
But with the broadcast burn, it looks like they're trying to make the biggest fire they possibly can, just at a time of year when it's sort of hard to make a really big fire.
So I just showed you the more interesting examples, but they are burning, as we saw in those 2D histograms, most times of the year. So they're even burning in June, and you can see there was a big rush to burn. There was a peak in June for broadcast burning. And I believe that was just to try to get as much fuel hazard out of the way, these grassy areas and the forested areas before the peak wildfire season comes in. So they are burning even when it's not like the wet and cool time of year, and their preferences just look slightly different. I think that they can work with a big range of conditions, and that's where the external parts of like what contingency resources are in place, and is it, did we get a little rain recently? Are we expecting some rain coming? Really come into play. But I don't know if they're necessarily trying to get the hottest conditions for broadcast burns, but it just depends on the time of year.
But there's not like a standard model that they use. They're just sort of using their intuition and experience.
Yeah, so they are using, from what I understand, and there's not a ton in the actual like published literature to understand what's happening here, but from what I have found and also talking to fire practitioners is that they use fire models and fuel models, and they have their burn project and they want to know what the objective, you have to know what the objective is and how much area you're wanting to burn, what your fuel type is. And then they can put in their different numbers and play with these simulations to figure out what their range should be to meet that objective. So they are doing a lot of planning with that. And then they're working with weather forecasters to get spot forecasts to see, are we going to be in this condition before we ignite? And then they have observations trying to make sure they're in those conditions. There's a lot of planning that goes into them, and it's not any one particular. So this is an aggregate. Like we would still obviously recommend that for any particular burn project that they're doing, they would be doing picking out all of their prescription criteria for that particular burn's objectives and fuel load. So this is just an aggregate. We can get an estimate of when those conditions might happen.
There's a question online. It says, I'm wondering if the thresholds for the grid met data were generated individually for each variable, or if the covariance among them was considered. Maybe the geopotential height threshold accounts for this.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way we did it is they just have to simultaneously fall into each range of variables individually. Another way to do it, which I wasn't quite sure how to do that with our analysis when we're trying to look at an aggregate sense. But yeah, the matrix approach of kind of the understanding, well, if it has been wetter lately, maybe we can tolerate a higher temperature. Or if it's cooler temperature, maybe things we're okay with, like it hasn't rained as recently. So I think that the practitioners keep this in mind, able to adjust and switch up the variables and ranges a little bit, but our analysis is just the individual variables meeting their typical criteria.
I'm curious if there's any understanding of how those large scale patterns have been changing with the climate, and if you know if anyone's like looked at how that changes burn windows.
Yeah, there have been, so I don't work in that space from the climate science perspective, but there are a couple studies that have looked at how the number of burn windows based on their definition has changed over time. They've done some climate model studies going back a lot longer than this data set and also decades into the future to see how these might shift. And I don't recall all of their results, but I know that it was that not necessarily that the opportunity for the number of burn windows was changing, but the time of year when those would open up was shifting. So you might have a shift slightly to more burn windows in winter, fewer kind of around the summer months kind of thing, is if I recall that correctly. But yeah, some people are doing that work where they're looking at how this opportunity might change in a warming climate.
I have sort of a social science question.
Sure.
So you showed the quote from your burn practitioner talking about how, was he engaging with the tool or he or she was engaging with the tool on your website and giving you feedback? How do you receive that information?
So that particular one was, I had given another seminar and they knew about it and reached out afterwards to talk about it. And then I think they just wanted the slides. They were interested because they do prescribe burns in Northern California for a private company. And they're like, oh, that sounds really relevant to my work. Just want to see the slides. And then I followed up, me kind of interested of like what it is that keeps them up at night, like what makes their question or their particular work difficult, what decisions are hard for them. And that was a really fruitful question because they came back with a long list of things that are difficult from them in making judgment calls. And one of them that they said was that they use that forecast tool, which is Tropical Tidbits. It's not my tool. It's just a graphical forecast webpage. And they use that, and in that exchange, they were just saying, I want these forecasts as long out as possible, even if they are not the most accurate, because it gives them some heads up of target times.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Have you had input and feedback from practitioners outside of that Northern California area?
So I've talked with some people in the Southeast. They actually have the most prescribed burning from what I understand, and they don't typically do pile burning. So theirs is mostly broadcast, and their conditions and their reasons for burning are a little bit different, but not too much from this area because I was mostly trying to understand what people were doing here and what the reasons for burning were in Northern California. So it would be hard. Like I was thinking about, could I do this analysis across the whole contiguous US, or even, and they also do prescribed burning in Alaska and Hawaii, but it's, the burn permits are not available everywhere in a public sense, or the data are lacking. So they may not actually have the day that a burn occurred or some of this information that would be needed to do the analysis. So yeah, that was one of my sort of wish lists of putting into the discussion part of the paper was more reporting on the type of whether that existed when they did the burn, exact timing of the burn, because sometimes you don't need a full day, you just need maybe 4 hours to do your burn. And then what the fire behavior was, did they meet the objectives? That kind of information isn't currently stored in any sort of large scale or consistent way across the US. But maybe, hopefully, in the future.
I was wondering, how do you see this pretty big increase in the target being met, given these like lessons learned? Like, is that like, you know, we need more resources, more people doing these fires, or kind of like looking like at really maximizing these potentials for each of these different categories, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you for your question. That's great. So I have one thing I can show, and I talk about this a little bit in the paper because they have a management applications section. So one idea that we had on how they could use this information was using it to identify target times of year that were maybe being underutilized. And so if you remember in the plot for broadcast burning, there was a peak in June of when they were doing the most ignitions. That was one of the top 2 months. But it turns out May actually has more burn windows of opportunity than June. So, and that's indicated by the red. This is just a difference of burn opportunities of May versus June. So both broadcast and pile give a lot of opportunities, and these these thin polygons are those high-risk fire sheds. So these align well with areas that they are trying to target to do more prescribed burning and reduce hazard in these high-risk fire sheds. So the idea is that if they can kind of work their policies and management to be more flexible when these times approach, then they can go out and use those. If they know they only have 5 days typically for a particular month in an area that they need to burn, then they really, maybe could be really proactive and making sure they're ready to go when those 5 days open up for a particular month. So we're imagining or envisioning this being used as giving more of a heads up of what could be expected and where it can be expected, and maybe shifting some resources based on the month that is going to be most suitable for burning. Thank you. Thank you.